Welcome back. So the 44th Southern African Development Community Summit for Heads of State and Government concluded in Zimbabwe this past weekend with a firm focus on resolutions pertaining to peace and security in the region. The gathering brought together leaders from across the region to deliberate on pressing issues that threaten stability and economic growth. President Cyril Ramaphosa, alongside International Relations Minister Ronald Lamola, led the South African delegation, contributing to discussions aimed at fostering regional cooperation and addressing ongoing challenges among member states. For more on the summit, let's bring in SABC News politics reporter Khayelihle Khumalo, who's with us here in Studio 9 in Auckland Park. Great to see you as always. Thank you so much. Popping by when you can. Fantastic. It's an important gathering coming at a crucial time for the region. Let's just begin with an overview of some of the salient points that emerged from it.
Well, it was an incredibly tough summit, and especially in the context of Zimbabwe. You know, some of the countries, especially the activists, were saying, look, looking at the crackdown in Zimbabwe, so many opposition leaders are incarcerated, their activists are jailed. So some were saying, well, move it away from Zimbabwe. But of course, I mean, this is a rotational summit. Each and every member state must host it. But when you look at some of the major issues, obviously the current situation in the eastern part of the DRC. That has been a very massive issue for SADC. It's a long-standing problem where we've seen so many missions trying to deal with the insurgency, the rise of, the M23 and many other groupings, the proliferation of militias. And as you know, that South Africa, alongside Malawi and Tanzania, they've contributed the troops to try and stabilize the situation. But generally, by and large, other issues that's dominated, of course, the drought problem in SADC region. Over 68 million people across the region are affected by drought. So that's a very huge issue when it comes to food and security. But of course, another very important issue that really dominated was around, of course, economic development. As you know, that SADC wants to industrialize.
Indeed, and it's interesting, the first point you make, because many will argue that solving a lot of these issues really hinges on good governance, which, of course, if you look at Zimbabwe's own track record, some people are saying that, it leaves a lot to be desired. How much of that elephant in the room, so to speak, could have been addressed given the dynamics within that bloc?
It's just quite interesting, and especially because, the neighbor of Zimbabwe, President Khayelihle, who is the former Troika chairing the Troika of SADC, he did not attend the SADC summit. Instead, he sent his foreign affairs minister, and there were so many rumors that even the foreign affairs minister brought his own water because of these diplomatic fallouts between Harare and Lusaka, really pointing to that issue, going back to the very elections that we saw in Zimbabwe in August last year, where the head of SADC, in terms of the observer mission, hailing from Zambia, really had a very scathing report in terms of the malpractices, a lot of issues that were not compliant with the guidelines of the region when it comes to the election. So it's a long-standing issue, but that was quite interesting. So President Khayelihle had to settle for a virtual session because he had to present a report, especially when you look at other pressing issues in the sub-region, the current situation in the Kingdom of Eswatini. But subsequently, that issue of Eswatini has been removed from the SADC Troika. But it's going to be a very big responsibility now for the new chairperson of the Troika, Tanzanian president, also who's facing concerns in her own country, where we saw opposition leaders being arrested.
Indeed. I suppose what took place and what didn't take place at the summit is going to give credence to people who believe in some way SADC is nothing but a big boys club, where these leaders and heads of states get together and really skirt around what they should be talking about over and above those other issues you've already pointed out. Because even people in Zimbabwe, when you look at the state of Harare, will tell you that it seems any kind of infrastructure development and refurbishment happened on the eve of the summit with the intention of putting out some kind of smoke screen and present, a country that isn't necessarily facing the challenges that the world understands they are.
Most certainly, and especially because when you look at the sudden development that we saw, the new parliament, where the leaders were really just taken into and taken away from a number of issues, especially because there was a great deal of trepidation and the fears that perhaps the activists may mobilize and band together and have these demonstrations and really just cause havoc. So that they try by all means to try and make sure that they really hide away from that issue. But another very important issue that really came out was around the unpacks, especially because when you look at the context of SADC region, the DRC appears to be the epicenter where quite a substantial number of cases have been reported, but also affecting a number of countries that are neighbors of the DRC. So what we do understand is that the SADC health ministers will have a meeting where they will try to look at ways to mobilize resources, of course, drawing lessons, for example, from COVID-19, especially when you look at how South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has been the champion of the AU when it comes to the pandemic prevention and the state of preparedness.
Yeah, absolutely. Migration should have featured, I imagine. It's a huge issue here at home. We know in our own elections in May, it was a major politicking point. How much attention did that receive?
Well, not really much this time around, but something also that really featured was around food security in the SADC region, especially given just the economies that have been underperforming for some time. I think that's why there was a very clear emphasis in terms of enhancement, in terms of pushing the trade, especially amongst the countries, dealing with those impediments at the borders, especially because, oftentimes leaders do meet, but practically it's always really concerning what really happens on the ground.
Yeah, South Africa has had its own economic challenges. We've seen our unemployment rate tick up just last month. And you touched on the fact that there is this kind of concerted effort to ensure that the region sees economic growth that we all want. Any kind of practical, solutions to how we get that right in the midst of these governance, structural challenges that are so prevalent in the region?
I think for the longest time, the issue of economic development, economic integration has been very central, has been very pivotal in terms of how the leaders are really just pushing this agenda. But what is always really concerning, it's when it comes to the practical issues. Is it really happening in terms of the bottlenecks, in terms of some of the challenges on the ground, in terms of the very enormous delays that you see at times at the borders, with all kinds of issues? Really, that is always the challenge. But of course, now the new chair of SADC, Zimbabwean President Emmerson Mnangagwa, was clear that, look, this is going to be his mantra. This is going to be the issue that he's really pushing at. But also in terms of other issues of mutual interest globally, obviously the SADC leaders, given the issue of liberation, how also they were once facing oppression, they were sympathizing with the people of Palestine, calling for a ceasefire, but also still pledging solidarity with Western Sahara, the only country in Africa that still remains under the yoke of colonialism, and sadly, under an African state, Morocco.
Sure, interesting indeed. A lot said and a lot not being said at the summit. Khayelihle, Khumalo, thanks as always for popping by. Appreciate that roundup of the 44th SADC Summit that wrapped up in Harare. That's in Zimbabwe. More of the day's top stories here on The Agenda in just a moment.